Hello, and welcome to the Inside Writing Podcast. I am your host, Josh Sippie. As a reminder, all of these episodes are recorded live Wednesdays, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can sign up on the Gotham Writers website for free. Now then, on to the show. Today, we're talking with Jasmine Darznick. Jasmine is the New York Times bestselling author of The Bohemians, which was also chosen as one of Oprah Daly's best books of historical fiction for 2021. Her debut novel, Song of a Captive Bird, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a Los Angeles Times bestseller. She holds an MFA in fiction from Bennington College, a JD from the University of California, and a PhD in English from Princeton University. She is now a professor of English and creative writing at California College of the Arts. Hello, Jasmine. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Josh. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning and good afternoon. So, Jasmine, you've amassed quite an impressive writing resume, but it had to start somewhere. So let's start at the beginning. What was that first creative spark that really kicked off your writing?
I think it's coming to America as a kid. So I immigrated to America when I was 5 years old. We came from Iran, and it really knocked me off the course of what would have been my life, whatever that would have been, and threw me into the arms of books. I was really shy and pretty awkward as a kid, and books were just my refuge. I didn't write, but I was entranced by language. I didn't speak English until I started school, and it always just seemed wondrous to me that you could make words. And I remember I have just vivid memory of, as a kid, loving to sit down and just writing, not necessarily that I was writing stories, but that I was making words was seemed like a feat of magic to me. So that's where it started.
So, I mean, you were an avid reader first. At what point in your readership did you think this is something I can do, that I should be doing?
That took a really long time. Honestly, it wasn't until I was in my 30s. So I loved reading, and I was good at writing essays. I never thought I could write fiction. But it was well into my 30s when I was in graduate school for English before I ever thought that I could publish anything, much less write a book.
So you mentioned you were already in school. What were you pursuing at that point? You hadn't thought oh, writing is something I should be doing. You were just studying it?
No, I had those kind of immigrant parents that put a lot of pressure. I either had to go to law school or medical school. I went to law school, and I knew pretty early on that I wasn't suited to becoming a lawyer. But I knew I loved learning, so graduate school was an extension of that. And I did a PhD, and I was doing a PhD in English, actually. Wanted to be a professor, again, just really not thinking that I would write creatively. I was headed toward a career in academia at that point.
But at this point, you were still reading creatively. What were you reading at that time that was really sort of stirring those creative juices?
I went into grad school thinking I was going to specialize in Victorian literature, and I came out with a degree in American literature and looking especially at immigrant women's writing. So it was it was quite a journey to get to that point. I was especially captivated by memoir. Memoir as a form is still probably my favorite kind of book to read. And when I was studying literature, that was the area of focus for me.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most interesting, I was reading the bio on your website. One of the most interesting lines I see there was you say you weren't supposed to be a writer, which I find that so interesting because most writers feel like, once they found this was what they were meant to do, but you weren't supposed to be. What do you mean by that?
Oh, I mean, really, it has to do with the strictures my parents set down. So I don't know how many parents are supportive overall, but immigrant parents don't tend to be all that supportive of these kind of. It was like I was running away with the Grateful Dead. I mean, becoming a writer was just such a crazy notion to them. And there were that I knew of, there weren't MFA programs. So it was in my family, it would have been a really revolutionary thing to stand up and say, I'm going to become a writer. And it wasn't something I said to myself either, honestly, for the longest time.
Mm-hmm. So you go to school, you get your PhD. We talked about the creative spark that sort of got you reading. What was that first moment that got you writing really creatively?
I was back home. So I went to grad school at Princeton, and I came back to California, and I lost my community when I came back to California. I didn't have I didn't know anyone, at least, whoever I knew in my program was back east. And so kind of on a lark, I signed up for a creative writing workshop at our local bookstore, my beloved bookstore, Book Passage. And I still, honestly, I was not thinking of writing as a profession or even as an ambition. It was just a way of finding some people, finding some of my people. And at that time, I had a small child. He was a toddler, and it felt so wonderful to get away from him, honestly. Anybody who's a parent, I think, can understand that statement right there. But it was on Friday nights, and it just felt like this glorious slice of time that was just mine and mine alone.
And how long were you in that workshop? And then, because I want to get to that point where you really started to pursue writing as a serious, like publishing, that kind of thing. So was it during this workshop that it really hit you?
It was. And it was really the encouragement of my teacher in that workshop. So it was a 10-week workshop. I did 2 years worth of those 10-week workshops. I just kept enrolling and enrolling. And probably halfway through that, my teacher took me aside and she said, you're writing a book. And I was totally flummoxed. I didn't know that was what I was doing, but she helped me see that. She saw that I had a project, I had a book in me, well before I did. And so I started sending things out when I was in that writing workshop. I started with personal essays, going to the local papers. The first piece I ever wrote, I got, I think, $100 for a local newspaper paid me. And oh my God, was it just, it was one of the most magical things that's ever happened to me, seeing my name in print in the local paper. And from there, I kept writing, and with each publication, I'd try to aim a little bit higher. So I worked my way up eventually to more national publications. And then I was on my way. I was on my way by that point.
$100 for a first, that's great. Most writers are like, they're just begging to be paid. So did that change things for you? I mean, it had to, like, this was something that you hadn't even really considered at in any big degree, but here you're getting paid for it. So did that change your mindset on what being a writer was at all?
It was validating. Now, it was only $100, so I don't think I was, I wasn't that delusional to think I could make a career, but it was wondrous to know that there were people interested in what I had to say. So I come from an immigrant background, I'm Middle Eastern. There were all kinds of things in my family telling me what I had to say wasn't really important or interesting. And then there were a lot of those kind of voices in the culture too. So getting those first publications really bolstered me. And with each one, I stood a little taller and I felt more confidence in stepping into that writerly role.
Mm-hmm. So you, like I mentioned, you have quite a few degrees, and you've also done this writing workshop. How has that impacted you as a writer? The workshop and do you feel like your higher education has helped you as a writer?
I think so. I mean, I don't know what my writing would have looked like if I had started in my 20s. By the time I was in my 30s, I had lived more. I had a child. I had certain experiences under my belt. I had also been reading. I'd been studying literature. Even law school, I was intellectually challenged by that. The kind of writing I do now is still very heavy on research. And I find that's what I love most about the writing I do, is that it's really a vehicle for learning, for educating myself. So it felt like great preparation. I don't regret at all that that's the course I took. Sometimes I feel like, if only I'd started just a little earlier. But on the other hand, I have a lot more, I guess I've got more focus now in my, having started in my 30s and now in my 40s, I've got a sense of urgency about writing that's very useful.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get back to the MFA now that you're teaching. I want to get back to that in a second, but I want to talk about your books now. So the first book you published, The Good Daughter's Memoir, and you said that that's your primary love was memoir. How did you go about now? Because memoirs are all personal. So how do you go about navigating the emotional weight attached to a memoir while still making it a publishable book, if that makes sense?
I think the best memoirs probably occur after a certain gestation period. Mary Carr talks about not being able to write about something until I think it's 7 years have passed. So by the time I was writing The Good Daughter, my first book, which is really about my mom's life, I had been thinking about the story for many, many years. And not that it didn't have a hold on me emotionally, it did, it had to, for me to feel compelled to write it. But I didn't feel squashed by it as I was writing it. And in fact, I think when you're writing a memoir, it gives you a kind of agency over the story. And I think in writing it, I was actually able to not fully, overcome certain things, but writing it blunted certain hurts that I was writing about.
Mm-hmm. And did you write it with the purpose of having it published? Did you have that in mind, or was it just like an exercise of creativity?
Well, the first pieces of it came out of that writing workshop, which, like I said, I really wasn't thinking to publish in any form. But by the time it was a book and, I was really working on it, I was hoping that it would be published. And I was also interviewing my mom. So the book is really based on oral histories with my mother. I spent about a year in conversation with her. The book's about her being married when she was 13 for the first time and giving up a child. And I didn't know that story growing up. So as I was interviewing her, I was really learning things for the first time about her, about our family. And so she knew that I was going to publish it. That was tricky because she wanted to control it in a way that, maybe if I'd waited until she passed on, I would have had more artistic license. But collaborating with her in this way, it was certainly really challenging, especially for a first book when you're not sure anything's going to pan out at all. So having, someone right on your shoulder can be really hard.
And that brings up the question that always has to come up during a conversation about memoir, which is, how do you write about people when you said she was over your shoulder? I mean, I imagine that other people come up in the story as well. How do you navigate that and wanting to portray people in the right light?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I say that book nearly killed me. It made me a writer, but it also nearly killed me because I was having to persuade her so often. I mean, really, I think you can't endeavor to write a memoir unless you're going to go there, right? Now, how do you get someone it was her story, really. I was facilitating. I had to get her to go there alongside me. So I was using a lot of my persuasive skills, whatever I had. And, it was definitely a different book than it would be. My mom's still alive, but if I wrote it now, it would be a really different book. The calculus in the end was, to me, it was such an important story to tell. It seemed worth it to fight for it and, sometimes to be kind of beaten down in the process.
So then, and we'll get back to more about this book in a second. Your second book, this one was the one that was about the Iranian poet Farooq Farrokhzad. And there's this theme in your third novel, the one that the Bohemian, is about Dorothy Lang. Yeah. It seems like you're drawn to historical figures and then crafting stories around them. What is it about these two that drew you to them that became like the centerpiece of your stories?
I'm really interested in artists, women artists especially. I think it takes such courage to be an artist, no matter what your gender. But as a woman, historically, that's been, really, it's been tremendously difficult for women. I've even felt it in my own life. And so I'm often looking for instructions on how to live my own life. And I go to artists' biographies often. So it's that. And it's also that I love research so much. It's that I love creating a world. When I'm reading, I love the feeling that I'm slipping into another reality. So writing historical fiction is a lot to do with that, with creating worlds and inviting readers in.
And what's the process like in taking actual historical people and making them fictional characters? What goes into that?
Yeah, for each project, it's different, honestly. And I came up with a credo early on, which is that I'd never make anything up. I'd never write anything that wasn't consonant with the truth. So there are moments when you're tempted, if I was writing straight up fiction, not biographical fiction, I could alter timelines. I could give someone, a different story, really. I could do away with inconvenient characters or bad choices. But when you choose to put somebody else's name or associate yourself with someone who's real, whether it's from your family or from history, I think you owe the person, even if they're deceased, some kind of. I think it's necessary to be respectful of the truth in that instance. So I get excited mostly by what I can't find about a person, and that's where I feel like I can really go in again with that credo of I want to keep it consonant with reality or what was. But there's so much, thankfully, that you don't know. Maybe you'll never know. In both those books, there were parts of the story that felt missing, and only fiction could make the story complete.
So, in accordance with your credo, you don't take any liberties, like because it's hard. You are filling in the gaps. Like, is there ever that concern of, well, what if this didn't really happen, or do you just draw the line? Well, this is fiction, so it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, if it were entirely faithful, I don't know that it would be interesting. And I say to myself and my students, I say, you've got to find the story in the history. So you might be shaving away certain aspects of the story, which I don't think is dissonant. I don't think is taking great liberties. But it's about, maybe expanding a moment that's only that's a moment. And the other thing I do that I do think is a respectful invention is that I write in first person. So with both those books, I'm simulating a memoir. I'm kind of performing a kind of first person account that never existed.
That's interesting, because I thought it would be easier for third. What is it? So I'm curious about the distinction between writing memoir and writing historical fiction from the point of view about somebody who actually, like, how was your process different writing a personal memoir versus writing a sort of fake memoir for somebody else?
They're more kindred than you might think. So when I was writing the memoir about my mother, I started off writing about her using her real name, calling her my mother, and it just felt so distant. The first readers of those pages weren't really connecting. And it was only when I gave my mom a pseudonym. And in a way, I was making her fictional. Now, what was happening was true, but just that step of giving her a pseudonym, that slight fictionalization, allowed me to get deeper into her character. Yeah. And then with the first person in Song of a Captive Bird and Bohemians, it forces you to work almost like an actor. So you're writing the script and you're also performing it at the same time. But at any given moment, I need to be thinking, what was she thinking? What was she feeling? Right. And really enlisting all the emotions in me and my knowledge of who she was in real life to create some sort of believable fiction through this kind of performance.
Mm-hmm. And naturally, since this is historical, a good deal of research goes into it, and that always comes up with historical fiction of how much research is enough research. So how do you handle research in regards to your fiction, and how do you know when it's enough?
Yeah, I really try to let my curiosity guide me. So I don't have a formula. I don't have a system. I'm just reading to get excited. When I feel myself just lighting up about something, and it can be really random things. Honestly, the things I get curious about are often really random. But I know now from having written the 3 books is that that's where the heat is. When you're lighting up, when you're interested in something, that's going to translate for a reader as well. So I love research. I think the yield, I was telling someone the other day, I think maybe I'm using 5% of what I find. Maybe. There's a line in Bohemians about Gumps, which still is actually a department store in San Francisco. I read a 500-page history of Gumps, and it yielded 1 sentence. But it was a good one.
That's great.
Right.
So how do you know? Because I've often heard that research can get in the way of people wanting to write historic because they feel like they just have to keep research. So when do you put pen to paper? Is that something you start right away and then fill in the blanks along the way? Or do you have to reach a point where you're like, I've consumed as much as I can. No, I'm going to start writing.
It goes in phases. So I'll start off researching, and I'm really looking for the contours of the story. So I want to know what are some of the major events, let's say, in a person's, Dorothea Lange's life. I've got those down, and absolutely there's a moment where I need to put that away because it can overwhelm and overshadow the creative process. So I step away, and then once I've got a draft that feels solid, it can take a while. It can take a year even. Once I've got that solid draft, then I trust myself to go back in and research the parts I don't know. So I might be keeping lists as I'm writing of all the things I need to find out, but I'm stopping myself from going deep into the rabbit holes, because that can really, I think it can really, for me, disturb my process, my creative process.
Mm-hmm. And then similar to memoir, since you are writing about people who actually live, I imagine they still have family and friends out there. Do you touch base with them? Do they know about, like, how does that work? Is there any discussions there?
Maybe it's having written my own memoir, my own family memoir, that's kind of made me a little scared and maybe a little leery, but I don't reach out to family members. In the case of Song of a Captive Bird, most of them were deceased when I was writing that novel about the Iranian poet. In the case of Dorothea Lange, she's got family. I live in the Bay Area. I know she's got family around here. I really just try not to let myself think too much about that response, because for me, it could be really crippling.
So no chat about publishing would be complete without a discussion about finding your agent. So I want to, at what point in the process did you think, okay, it's time to get an agent? And where were you when you got an agent? Did you get it before your memoir, after your memoir? How did it work for you?
Yeah. So again, back to that creative writing workshop at Book Passage, my writing teacher taught us, she gave us the old fashioned method, which was to search in acknowledgement sections of books that we liked. And I kept coming across a certain name, Sandy Dykstra, and she had represented, I knew that she was, she specialized in women's writing, and especially in international or ethnic writing. And so that seemed like a good fit. I knew so little, which I think was my blessing, really, because I didn't know enough to be scared. I just queried that one agent. I almost feel embarrassed to say, to say this, because I know it can be such an arduous process for people, but I queried just the one agent. She didn't sign me right away. It was about a 6-month courtship. So I sent in a pretty trim proposal, and they liked my writing. I had maybe 70 pages of the memoir written, but the proposal was pretty spare. And so basically I was told, go off and create a more substantial proposal for this, and we'll see. So there were no promises or assurances, but it was a certain push. And so I worked about 6 months. I drafted, it was longer than the pages themselves. It was at least 100-page proposal for the memoir, which was important work that I might not have otherwise done. In the meantime, I was also publishing and sending things out, personal essays for the most part. I was sending stories to contests, and every time I would have some piece of good news, I would always send it with a little, note of, oh, just wanted to share this with you. And six months of this, I think of it as a courtship, 6 months of this courtship, and then they were ready to sign.
That's all. Yeah, it's fascinating because everybody has a different story with how they got their agent, and so you only ever queried one agent. That's fascinating.
I did.
How did things?
Still my agent.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How did things change for you after that? Like, because everybody's relationship with their agent is different. Does she leave you to do your own thing, or do you bounce ideas off of her, or how does your team work?
It has changed over time. So with the first book, she mostly the closest relationship I had at that point was my editor. I was working really closely with the editor who acquired the book, and she was pretty hands off. This 2 books I've written since, and the one I'm working on now, I've worked really closely actually with her to come up with a summary of the story. So this is something I didn't do when I started writing. I just would kind of write when I felt like it, or I wrote what I think, and now I'm more focused, and I sit down before I attempt to write a book. For sure, I'll sit down and I'll draft an outline of it. It's provisional. I tell myself it's provisional. I don't feel bound to it, but I'll sit and get through that, and then I share it with Sandy, with my agent, and she'll get very excited and then she'll come back a few days later and tell me everything that's wrong with it. And then the real work starts. And I resent it at the time, probably. But because, you just want to hear that it's good and it's going to sell and it's going to be fantastic. But she'll correct my course a bit and I'll resent it. But then in the end, I think her guidance is really prudent. She knows me well enough, and she really, I do get the feeling that she really just wants the best for the book. And she's willing to spend a lot of time with me figuring out what form that's going to take.
How do you know what comes next? Like what project comes next? Because your projects are so like, you wrote the memoir about your family and you focus specifically on one person. The next, how do you know what comes next? And have you ever like started an idea that just didn't follow through and you put it aside?
Not with books. That hasn't happened. I don't have, a couple of books in a drawer somewhere. I've tried to, I've just stuck with things long enough, and I've been fortunate that I have been able to publish what I've been interested in. I get really interested in certain periods of history. So I know now that I'm very, very interested in the 1920s and 30s. So that's a time period I feel very comfortable in. And so when I was thinking about the next book after Bohemians, I was really thinking, how can I stay here longer? Because I like it here. I like this time period. I've got more to say about it. And so it starts with the time period and then the place, and then I go scouting for characters and stories.
So do you only have one idea going at a time? Because I know for a lot of writers, we're like all these different things are floating around in our brain. Do you just have that one story and everything works into that, or are there a few ideas that you could go towards?
Oh, I think I'm just lucky if I have the one idea. I don't know. I think I would drive myself a bit crazy if I was toggling between the two ideas. And my books have changed a lot. When I say those outlines are provisional, they often change a lot from inception to completion. But I do stick with things and make them interesting and try to finish them, even if they're very different from what I thought they were going to be in the beginning.
With your work, there's always usually a message or a theme, and I feel like yours definitely carry a deeper theme and a message to them. And I'm always curious, do you actively engage with a theme when you're writing a story, or do you kind of just focus on character and plot and the theme just goes along with it because it's something that's sort of subconscious?
I avoid thinking about theme. That would be the literary scholar in me. And I think when you put that, it's like thinking a lot about politics or any kind of cultural message that you might care a lot about. But if you're thinking too consciously as you're writing about it, I think it just deadens the story. And so I'm letting things be told and be shown through the characters, through the situations. I'm not surprised when people, will come back and get a certain life philosophy or outlook. And I'm always pleased if it does fall in line with my dearly held beliefs, but that's not what I'm leading with when I'm writing.
And what would you say because there's character, there's plot, there's setting. It sounds almost like you're leading with setting. You get so set in these time periods. Is that what your primary push is?
Definitely. If I could just write about places and times, I would do that. Unfortunately, you've got to put people in the story, but place is so important for me. Place is really where character comes from for me.
Do you find it difficult at all balancing all those story elements when you primarily want to write setting? Like, do you have to force yourself to develop characters or does it all, because it's always such a negotiation writing, like, well, now I need to focus on plot, on character, on saying I have to balance them all. Do you have trouble balancing? Do you ever feel like you overdo one and have to work the other in more?
I've gotten better at it, but I had to cut about 100 pages from my first book because it was just too much setting. I was just giving too much, essentially, backstory. I was setting the scene for so long, and the story wasn't really properly starting until about, page 101 or so. So that had to go, and it was painful. But that's why I do the outlining now, is that I need to be sure, because plot does not come as easily to me. I need to have some kind of confidence that there's a story there, and outlining it helps so much in having that confidence.
And you beat me to the next question, which was the whole outline versus just go at it. So you start with an outline, and Similar to the research question, how much do you outline? Is it like fully fleshed out? You know exactly everything's going to happen before you start, or do you leave some room for improvisation?
Well, I do. I have for the last 3 books, I've sold the books on the outline and a few chapters. So it has to have an arc, but the book, like I was saying, it can change so much. And probably in the end, I mean, it's different for each one, but for the last book, probably 50% of what was in the outline stayed and 50% of the story departed quite a lot, in ways that totally surprised me. And I like it like that. I like that kind of, feeling like there's a guardrail there, but also feeling like it can cut loose and, just be surprised by the story.
And is there a similar process with short stories? Because it's a different process for each one. So do you outline short stories as well?
I don't write a lot of short fiction anymore. I did when I started writing. I write essays, which are, of course, different. But with essays, I have a similar experience to short story writing for me, which is that I can get through them. If I'm really just devoted to the story for about a week, I can cycle through the whole process from idea to final draft in about a week, which is really satisfying. Novels do not give you that kind of satisfaction. Novels are just, long plod. But the essays, which are somewhat kindred to the short stories, give me that satisfaction of something I can complete pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get back to writing as well, but I want to talk about your teaching, because you now teach at the MFA level, creative writing in English, as we mentioned at the start of the show. What was it that inspired you to go back and start teaching this as well, to go alongside your writing?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a professor. That was where I always knew I wanted to be in a classroom. I didn't know that I was going to teach creative writing, but I decided at a certain point to go back and get an MFA specifically because I wanted to teach in an MFA program. So I went back to Bennington. I already had a PhD by then. I published a book, but I went back and got the MFA. And for me, it's just total joy to be with graduate students. They're so there. I teach undergrads as well, and they have their own charms, but the grad students are just, they're just they're so excited and eager for what you have to give them. And I find myself really just inspired by them, honestly.
So next question was, how does it affect you as a writer? And it sounds like you were kind of getting there already. So do you feel like teaching makes you a better writer? Does just seeing other people's work, working with them, does it help, sort of get your creativity going?
It humbles you. So I think you're always cognizant of how hard it is. I mean, I watch my students growing so much, and they're often really putting very vulnerable material out there. It takes a lot of courage to be a writer. So it's reminding me that that's what it takes in my own work is that kind of courage. I think more than anything, honestly, it's indirect. So I'm getting out of my office, out of my head, and actually talking to other people for a few hours a week, which is good for me in the end. I might think, oh gosh, I could use those hours for my own writing, but it helps a lot to have something. And for other people, it could be different things. But for me, the teaching gives me that room to sort of breathe, to have some space in my life that's not just me in my head.
Mm. So correct me if I'm wrong, you said you went back to get your MFA so that you could teach at an MFA level, but going back and getting that MFA, how did that, because that's like the big reckoning for a writer, is get the MFA or not. So I assume that affected you as a writer as well, did it not?
To have gotten the MFA?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, when I was coming out of college, I had never heard of an MFA program. I didn't know you could go to school for writing. So what I got was, well, first of all, I had an amazing cohort. My cohort, we're still in touch, and they're such a terrific gift from that program for me. And then also mentorship, which is something I hadn't had before. So I was publishing, but without those kind of really wonderful those wonderful relationships that you get out of the programs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I have to ask, because it is constantly debated, should writers go for an MFA? What is your professional opinion on when a writer should look at an MFA or when they shouldn't?
Yeah, I think go for it, honestly. I think there are so few opportunities in our lives to just bracket 2 years for writing, and it is expensive and it will cost you in other ways for sure, but to find other people who get you and who understand how much writing means, right? I mean, that is just such a blessing, and it can totally transform your writing. Honestly, I think the work that potentially you can do in 2 years in an MFA program translates to maybe 15 years on your own, kind of sort of cobbling workshops together here and there. Not that it can't be done, and maybe for some people it is better to go it alone, but having people there expecting you to show up with your pages in hand, even when you don't think you're ready, that can change you totally.
Is there like a opt or like the best time to go for an MFA? Like, do you do it right after graduating? Do you take some time? Does it just vary based on the writer?
I'm so lucky that I have both kind of students, and I see the advantages to both ways. So I've got students who come straight from undergrad. I have students who are coming, sometimes they have their children are now in college and it's the first time they can do it. So, and I've seen success in both ways. So really, really that's an individual choice, and it can be a success no matter when you start.
Mhm. So I want to get to some audience Q&A. I have some more questions here that I think we'll get back to, but let's get to some audience questions first. So first question, back to the first book, the memoir. How would this be a different book if you wrote it now, and why?
Yeah, well, when you're writing a memoir, the end, so many things about it could be different, but the ending is a moving target. So you've got to find a moment to stop the story that will feel satisfying for you as a writer and also for the reader. So when I was writing The Good Daughter 10 years ago, my mother was in fully good health. She was, like I was telling you, she was very involved with the process. My mom has Alzheimer's now. She's got a late stage Alzheimer's, and I have, I could really write anything now. So that back and forth and the real, the struggle that I had in working so closely with her, that would be gone. She's a different person. I'm a different person. Other things have happened to us in our lives. So I think that I also have a kind of tenderness toward her because I've seen her through her illness that would have given a different shape or feeling to the memoir. When I was writing it, I wasn't in the heat of anger toward her, but I still had anger toward her. And you could feel the bite of that in the memoir. I think you'd feel it less if I were writing now.
Mm-hmm. And then I actually want to follow up with a question there in that, do you see yourself ever going back to writing memoir, or do you think you found your historical fiction as like the happy place?
I'm really enjoying not writing memoir. So I love essays, and I for sure would love to continue writing essays, which are, they're miniature memoirs, I think of them. But I don't know that I would go back, honestly. I wouldn't tell that story. I don't think I've lived necessarily such a compelling life since that I'd want to go back. I admire people like Mary Carr who are telling their life story at 10-year intervals. They're going in again and again. But the great thing about fiction is that you can use things that have happened to you that still hurt you, that you're not done with, but you're writing at a remove, and you're not always feeling. I had the feeling when I was writing memoir or writing primarily in nonfiction that I was always just scooping my guts out every time. Every time I was going to the page, it was just like, right. And I have a deep feeling for my characters, but I don't feel eviscerated on a daily basis by fiction. And I like
Gotcha.
that. Yeah.
Makes sense. Next question, also about the memoir, but how do you handle writing honestly when other people in your story have a different recollection of events?
I was fortunate that my father had passed away. The two other main characters in my memoir had both passed away. So I didn't need to worry about them. I'm an only child, so I didn't have to think about my siblings. I think you got to get to the point, everybody decides this differently. But for me, it was, what does the story need? What does the story need? And that's not always what I feel comfortable telling, or what those around me might want me to say. There was a lot that no one wanted me to say, but I feel so strongly as a reader that that's what memoir gives you, is that kind of, that kind of bare honesty is so alive and rich on the page. And if I can't go there, I don't know that I would try.
Makes sense. Next question. What are some story writing contests that you would recommend? So what you mentioned you were submitting to contests. What contests were there?
So I don't even know if some of these are still in existence, but I entered a contest with Zoetrope, which was a magazine out of San Francisco. Let me think. The Iowa Review Prize. That was another one. I think the landscape has changed a lot, but contests were important. I don't know, and I haven't talked to editors about this, but I have a feeling that you get a little bit more attention, a little bit more of a chance when it's a contest. So contests were really important, and for those who are building their writing careers up, that's a place for sure to spend some time thinking about outlets. Yeah.
And I want to follow up with that with a question for me, which is, do you feel like writing short stories and essays, did that prepare you to write a book, or do you feel like those are just two separate things?
It's that confidence issue that I was talking about earlier. So, it's such a huge gap. From not having published anything to writing a book, such a huge gap that I think for some people it would just be insurmountable, right? How do I get from here to there? But if you've got some essays, some short stories, and you're able to publish them to get that validation of your name in print, so to speak, or on a screen, it closes the gap a little bit, and it gives you the courage to keep going, to keep moving toward that bigger thing. So they're related for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Next question. Hi, Jasmine. When you began writing, were you a disciplined writer? Did you write every day, and are you inspired to write every day now?
So life gets in the way. When I started writing, the only reason I could write is that my son went to preschool for 3 hours at a time. I would drop him off. I would go into the library, and that was all the time I had, which was terrific because it was just short enough. And I would dawdle for about the first hour or maybe two. And then that third hour, I knew, this is it, now or never. You got to pick up your kid in an hour. So I'd get cracking in that third hour. And I did write, that was my practice, is I would go to the library after dropping him off. That set up some good habits. I find that if I've got a project, if I have some kind of external goal, like I'm going to turn this into my agent, or I'm going to submit to a contest, or I want to send this, those kinds of external incentives or frameworks are really, really helpful. So in those situations, I feel like I don't have to force myself. I'm really thinking of the goal, and that's getting me to the desk and to the page.
Mm-hmm.
And then now, on a daily basis, I try to do something for my work every day. And this is what I tell my students too, is even if it's 15 minutes of just going through your draft or reading a section aloud, it's so hard to get back into writing if you step away from it. The formula I think of sometimes is, if you step away for a day, it takes you 2 days to get back to the place you were. So, oh my gosh, let a week or a month go by, and it's really hard getting back to where you were. So if I try to just spend that 15 minutes at least, right? And I do write a lot on weekends because I'm teaching during the week or taking care of my family. I will just, I'll just set aside hours in the mornings on Saturday, and that's when I write.
Next question. How do you plot a novel or focus on plotting in the first draft?
Focus on plotting it. So I conceded that plotting is it's the hardest thing for me. Trouble. It's about trouble. You got to keep trouble happening. Trouble is the lifeblood of good fiction. So continuing to complicate things. Giving your character goals and then continually throwing up obstacles in their path. With Bohemians, I spent a lot of time thinking about what is Dory, who's a version of Dorothea Lange, what does she most want? set her on a course toward getting that. I made it harder and harder for her to get it. When she finally got it, it became the source of great misery for her, right? So, trouble, keeping the trouble going that's how I think about plot. And I feel like it does, for me, it does emerge from character. So the character, thinking about the character deeply will also enrich your plots and your plotting.
And I actually have a question about characters. Since you write from the point of view of historical people, are the side characters do you invent side characters and or are they actual people as well?
So with Bohemians, I took a character who was a very small figure in Dorothea Lange's life. So Dorothea Lange, the photographer, had a Chinese American assistant when she started out in San Francisco. And that was she was maybe a paragraph in a biography, and she became, top billing in the novel. So she's invented based partly on fact, but I think, in historical fiction, if you can have a character who's not strictly speaking historical or biographical, it gives you a little bit more room to maneuver. And you might really need that because in other respects, you're being quite careful to stay true to what was. So if you can insert a character who wasn't there, right, it can just open up some space for you to do other things.
Next question from the audience. Do you ever get into a writing slump? And if so, how do you get out of it?
Slump. Writing slump. This is really hard for me because I feel like I could really use a break more often than I let myself have one. And it's probably where I'm headed fastest toward my slump is where I'm really pushing myself beyond. I'm not letting myself take a rest, let's say between books or between essays, right? And you just need that time, I think, to come down, create this new work. It's huge work. So resting, if I can let myself rest, I think that helps me not slump or slide into a slump. Reading great fiction, honestly, the worst slumps or some of the worst ones are when I can't find anything really good to read. So, that's a priority, is to make sure that I'm feeding myself really good fiction, because that energizes me pretty much more than anything if I'm reading something. And there's a lot of stuff I don't read anymore. Pretty good fiction, I just don't read anymore. It has to be something that makes me envious in the best possible way, like that just fills me with a sense of awe and, oh my God, I don't think I can do this, but I really want to try.
So then to follow up on that, we have two people now asking, who are some of your favorite authors?
Well, growing up in Northern California, Isabella Allende was one of my favorites. Amy Tan, they were local authors and I got to see them lots, and they're still among my favorite writers. I love the English writer Sarah Waters a lot. She writes historical fiction that's a little edgy, I might say, unconventional. Love Colson Whitehead. There's a class of historical fiction that I'm really drawn to, like Nickel Boys, Colson Whiteheads, where the writer is really excavating a history that's been lost. That's the kind of thing that just gets me really excited in my own work, and I'm always looking for. So Colson Whitehead, and then someone I go back to a lot for plot actually is T.C. Boyle, who I think is really masterful in trouble.
Gotcha. And next question, what are your current goals for your writing and publishing?
So I'm right, to keep going, which is not easy, and you don't know how long you can, right? So getting to keep going is a big deal. With each book, I want to try something a little different. So it might be a different historical period, or I think this book I'm writing right now, it's also biographical fiction. And in this case, I'm compressing a timeline. It's a shorter timeline. So keeping things challenging myself as in craft as I go along is a huge thing for me. the next time around, the big jump for me is going to be what I think is the book after the one I'm writing right now will be straight up fiction. I'm terrified. Can I do it? I don't know. I'm not sure, because I've always had some sort of, some map before, some kind of map that history has laid down for me. So I'm a little scared, but I hope that as I keep going, I'll gain the confidence to do that kind of writing.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let me get a couple more questions in here before we're done. So I want to ask you about, because this is something that I feel like all writers struggle with as well, separate from writer's block, but this idea of imposter syndrome. Do you ever suffer like with the thought that, it's not good enough? Is that something you struggle with, and how do you overcome it?
All the time. And I have read that, in fact, the more educated you are, especially as a woman, the less confidence you have in yourself, which is terribly perverse and really disturbing. But I'm not sure that that's part of it. But I am very aware, as someone, who studied literature at length and in depth, of how far I am from, the writing that I consider great. So that's daunting, to be so aware of of fine writing and to be measuring yourself up against that. I do struggle with it. And the only way, Josh, honestly, is to just, as much as I can, get it down to me and the page and the story, right? And get back to, my God, if I had a formula for this, I would share it right now. But, getting back to that sense, when you're a kid, I'm just making something, right? Like getting so far away from how is this going to be received, or what kind of, advance could I get for it? I think that if you start out with those preoccupations, that too can really deaden the project, right? Mm-hmm. So somehow getting to that pure place of I'm just making something, and it's giving me pleasure to make this thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question here from the audience, which is, how long did it take you to write your first novel?
For the first novel or the memoir?
Let's say the first novel, because that's what she wrote.
First novel. It took me 4 years, which is 2 years less than my memoir took me, and Bohemians took me 2 years. So I'm getting faster as I'm going, because I've learned to recognize certain of my How to Murder My Darlings, right? That famous quote. But I love description, so I'm no longer spending 100 pages setting up the scene. I know now, I've kind of trained myself that no, you don't get to do that. You've got to start with trouble in mind. Things have to be in motion. So I think that's why I'm getting a little faster, as I'm more cognizant of my own blind spots. And the big thing is I'm starting with a provisional outline.
So then the last question I always ask before we let you go is, if I were to say, what's one piece of advice you would give to writers who want to get to the point where you are, to have these published books out there, what would you tell them?
I think you should really trust the weird things that excite you. So no book I've ever written has seemed like a good idea to anybody, even me, honestly. I mean, you're going to write a novel about this Iranian poet in the 50s. I mean, who cares about that, right? Or you're going to write a novel about this photographer, who can, So, but the longer I've been at this, I've found that it's actually the weird that gets you places. So whatever your weird is, cleave it to your chest, trust it, nourish it, really, really get into the weird, and it'll take you places.
I think trust the weird things that excite you is one of my favorite things I've heard on this show. So that thank you. That's a great line to hear. And then before I let you go, where can people find you online? You have a website, you have social media. Where can people find you?
Sure. You can go to jasmindarznik.com. I am always sharing stuff on social media, on Instagram especially. So if you love backstories, I've got a lot of them.
All right. So to all of our listeners, thank you for being here today. Jasmine, thank you so much. This was a great discussion.
Oh, my pleasure. So great talking with you. And thanks everybody for being here.
Yes. And again, to all of our listeners, we're going to be back same time next week. We're talking to Eric Smith. Until then, we'll see you next time. And thank you for being here.